Are we allowed to eat pig's meat today or not? That's the challenge that I want to address, and it comes from a Muslim who is citing Isaiah chapter 65 as evidence for his case. And he says that in Isaiah 65, this chapter speaks about future prophecies and promises that God Almighty is making for the future people of Israel. And then he quotes a passage from Isaiah 65. This is verse 3, or this is where it begins. He says, "They keep making me angry by sneering at me, while offering sacrifices to idols in gardens and burning incense to them on bricks. They spend their nights hiding in burial caves. They eat the meat of pigs, cooked in sauces made of stuff unfit to eat. And then they say to others, 'Don't come near us. We're dedicated to God.' Such people are like smoke, irritating my nose all day." And so then the Muslim concludes, he says, "See, here we see that pork eaters are so detested by God Almighty that he's likened them to smoke irritating his nose all day, and so therefore eating pork is detestable by God Almighty in the Bible." So what is it? Is eating pig's meat today allowed or not? My answer is simple: bacon. Okay, so maybe the bacon answer would be sufficient for those of you who are bacon lovers like myself. But for those of you who are not, perhaps you want some more. Okay, and so I'm willing to indulge you on that. Now, in order to really understand the context of Isaiah 65, we have to realize that although, yes, God is speaking about some prophetic elements that are going to happen in the future, however, the section in which this Muslim cites is a section in which Isaiah is listing various offenses that the children of Israel have committed against God. And these are all offenses that are listed in the Mosaic Law. Now, the Mosaic Law is a contract between God and Moses and the children of Israel. And there's about 613 commands in there, and some of the commands include things about rituals and sacrifice and clean and unclean foods and so on and so forth. But yes, they also include a prohibition from eating pork, okay, or meat from pigs. So when Isaiah there is listing all of these offenses, he's referring to the past disobedient behaviors of Israel, and of course chastising them, because at that point in time when Isaiah is writing, the Mosaic Law was still in effect. However, today the Mosaic Law is no longer in effect. Why? Because Jeremiah 31, in fact, talks about a new covenant that God's going to establish with his people. And so that the Mosaic Law, the old covenant, will no longer be binding. Hebrews 8 talks about how that new law, that new covenant that God establishes with his people, makes the old law obsolete. Okay? Now, what is this new covenant? What is this new sort of contract that God has with people? It's through Jesus Christ. When Jesus Christ comes along, he fulfills the requirements of the Mosaic Law. He fulfills the requirements of that contract and then establishes a new covenant in his blood. And so therefore, when he does that, the old requirements of clean and unclean food, of not eating pork, of the ritual sacrifices, and all those things are no longer binding, are no longer relevant for the New Testament believer. So that alone would make the case that therefore eating pork products today would be morally permissible. In fact, the entire book of Galatians is one long argument that Paul makes against New Testament believers no longer feeling bound by the Mosaic Law. He's saying the old covenant is no longer binding in the New Testament believer. Now, the context there is about circumcision, because again, that was part of the Mosaic Law. But all of Galatians is one giant point about how we are no longer bound by that Mosaic Law, and therefore we are free from it, and we are now under a new covenant, and that is the covenant under Christ. In fact, we even see in 1 Timothy 4, Paul talking about how some people were still requiring that people abstain from certain foods. But then Paul goes on to say, no, God has created all things, and all things are good. All food is okay to eat, and nothing should be rejected. And the reason is because there's nothing intrinsically sinful about pork products. Okay? There's nothing sinful intrinsically about the meat of a pig. Yes, God had a commandment to Israel in the past to no longer to eat that meat, but when the Jews violated the command, what they were guilty of was violating the commands against God, not necessarily because there was something intrinsically wrong with the meat of pigs. It's kind of like with Adam and Eve. When they ate the fruit, Okay? There was nothing intrinsically evil about the fruit itself. It was the fact that they were disobeying God's commands. And of course, that's why pork products are morally okay for us to eat today. So go out tonight and have yourself a bacon-wrapped filet mignon, and just make sure it's medium rare.